It's one thing to play in your own studio, but then to play before a large group and get the large group to appreciate your gift and your interpretation of the music. That requires understanding what the role of the musical performer is. And that's what I'm talking about when I say that Roosevelt understood what being president was all about, how to act the role of a president. Roosevelt was perfectly sincere in his endorsement of various New Deal projects, but he knew that it was more than that. Herbert Hoover was sincere as could be, but he didn't know how to carry off the role. Okay. I think I've got a number of loose ends here, and I'm not quite sure where to start tying them up. Oh, I know. What advice, yeah, I was about to get to this. What advice would Franklin Roosevelt give to Barack Obama? Or, well, Franklin Roosevelt's not here to give advice, so I'm going to speak on his behalf. Historians have to be careful speaking on behalf of dead presidents. Although, well, sometimes presidents aren't quite as dead as we sometimes think. I gave a lecture in Chicago about a month and a half ago. And I was going to talk about Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt. And I was going to talk about the difficult personal relationship they had. And it's one of the most, what shall I say, fascinating, sometimes heartening, sometimes dismaying stories in American public life. And part of it was played out in public. It was known that Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt did not spend much time together. In fact, somebody at the Washington Post, it was either in the late 30s or early 40s, was once mischievously inclined to write a headline that said, "News flash, Mrs. Roosevelt spends night at White House." Because she spent so few nights at the White House. She was always gone. It was understood that theirs was a, shall we say, kind of loose relationship. Well, without going into the details of what it was that made the relationship kind of distant. It was distant emotionally at one level, but it was very complicated to say the least. And if somebody would ask a question, I could get into the complications. But the one thing that I will say is, to this audience in Chicago, I was going to go into the complications. And these are complications that I was quite comfortable talking about when the subjects were dead and gone. Just before I was going to go on, I was introduced to this tall, very striking-looking woman who was probably 75 years old. And she was introduced to me, and she said, "I've come to your lecture, I'm very interested." And she was introduced to me as Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, the granddaughter of Eleanor Roosevelt, whose given name was Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, and whose mother was Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, whose daughter was Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, and, as it turns out, whose granddaughter was Anna Eleanor Roosevelt. And so the current Anna Eleanor Roosevelt was sitting in the front row. And I did not have the nerve to give the lecture that I was prepared to give. So I talked about Roosevelt's leadership in World War II. We historians have to be careful, as I say, saying too much about the private lives of presidents. Gleaves knows the name Arthur Link. Arthur S. Link was an eminent presidential historian. More precisely, he was an eminent historian of Woodrow Wilson, a longtime professor at Princeton University, where Wilson himself had been a longtime professor and president of the university before he went off into politics, became governor of New Jersey, and then president of the United States. Link was the editor of Wilson's papers. And as the editor of Wilson's papers, he had an inside view of Woodrow Wilson. And he knew things about Woodrow Wilson that other historians did not know. Now, he was editing the papers, and they were all going to be published, and they eventually were published in what is really, I think, the gold standard of a publication, a published series of presidential papers. Is the papers of Woodrow Wilson, of Princeton University Press. And Arthur Link, over the years, became so closely, what shall I say, connected to Woodrow Wilson, became so emotionally invested in Woodrow Wilson that others in the historical profession began to think that Link somehow believed he was channeling the spirit of Woodrow Wilson. Now this is okay, I guess. This kind of thing happens. You work on a president for 40 years and yeah, you become connected. But there was a moment that became a little bit embarrassing. Well, sort of. I'll tell you, this is what happened. Now, I wasn't there, but a good friend and former colleague of mine was there, and she was a very close friend of Arthur Link. And she tells the story with great glee. Arthur Link was this very proper Princeton president. Never went anywhere, certainly not to work, but I don't even think he went down to the kitchen to get a midnight snack without a coat and tie on. And so he attended conferences of historians, and there was this one conference of historians where the historians were all talking about the private lives of presidents. And somehow discussion came around to, well, I mean, what about the sex lives of presidents? And it was known that Warren Harding, for example, had a mistress in the White House. This was before Bill Clinton became president. And historians were just beginning to learn that John Kennedy had had a number of affairs and that Lyndon Johnson had had various affairs. But some people, because Arthur Link was there, and because he was this sort of stiff, rather proper individual, a very tall, distinguished-looking guy with this shock of white hair that he combed straight back, somebody decided, well, whether it was to tease Arthur Link a little bit or simply to state what seemed to be conventional wisdom, said, well, the one person we can be sure didn't have any affairs was Woodrow Wilson. Because Woodrow Wilson had this public persona as a rigid Presbyterian, and he often acted as though he took his orders directly from God rather than from political advisors or anything like that. When Wilson was elected, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee came up to him and said, now, Mr. President-elect, there have been a number of people who have worked very hard for the success of your campaign. And Wilson was supposed to draw the conclusion from this, and, well, because they had contributed to his election, they expected to be remembered when the jobs were handed out. And Wilson stood up and looked this Democratic chairman in the eye and said, I have you know that God made me President of the United States. Now, whether he actually believed it or not, or this was just his way of saying, forget it, I'm not paying any favors. So anyway, Wilson has this reputation of being this rather stiff individual. And to imagine Woodrow Wilson having any kind of affairs outside of his marriage, just no. Well, Arthur Link, at this point. Now, Arthur Link knew more about Wilson's correspondence, about Wilson's diaries and everything else, than anybody else did, because he had them, and he hadn't published them all yet. And Arthur Link stood up. This was kind of around a lunch table. This wasn't in one of the formal sessions. Around a lunch table. He stood up, and in this booming voice, first of all, standing up, kind of got the attention of everybody. And then he said, I'll have you know that Woodrow Wilson was the sexiest president in American history. See, what do you do with this? Well, in fact, what you did with it was, eventually Link did publish the correspondence, and it became apparent that Wilson indeed had had an extramarital affair. And in fact, this is one of those cases where, when Bill Clinton was president, and he was having this dalliance with Monica Lewinsky, there were some people who wondered how he could keep his mind on his work while he was otherwise engaged. But apparently, he was able to compartmentalize, and that's when this term became popular during the 1990s.